Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the muddy, morally bankrupt, and absolutely ruthless world of medieval tax collection, where ambition, greed, and zero ethical boundaries created one of history's most fascinating success stories. So, before you settle in for this wild ride, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely into these deep dives into humanity's darker impulses. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and what drew you to stories about corruption and power. It's always amazing to see who's fascinated by the art of systematic theft. Now get comfortable. Maybe grab a warm drink to contrast the cold, calculating nature of what we're about to explore, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're about to follow the incredible transformation of Thomas, a name that means doter, which is perfect because tonight we're going to doubt everything we think we know about right and wrong in medieval England. This isn't your typical rags to riches story. This is the tale of an orphaned street kid who didn't just climb the social ladder, he rebuilt it entirely to serve his own purposes. We're talking about a man who turned corruption into an art form, who made theft look like public service, and who literally rewrote the rules of government to legitimize his own criminal enterprise. So buckle up, because over the next 20,000 words, we're going to witness one of the most complete moral transformations in history, told through the intimate, uncomfortable lens of second-person narration that puts you right in the mind of medieval England's most successful tax collector. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at government efficiency the same way again. You weren't born corrupt. That came later, with opportunity and necessity dancing a wicked waltz in the muddy streets of your ambition. Your first breath was drawn in a cramped room above a baker's shop in Winchester, where the smell of rising dough mixed with the less pleasant aromas of medieval urban life. Your mother, a seamstress with calloused fingers and kind eyes, counted every penny twice before spending it once. Your father hauled sacks of grain for merchants, his back permanently bent from years of lifting what other men owned. They named you Thomas, after the doubting apostle, though they couldn't have known how fitting that choice would prove to be. Childhood in Winchester meant narrow streets, narrow opportunities, and even narrower margins for error. You learned to read by candlelight, your mother sounding out letters while mending tears in rich men's clothes. The irony wasn't lost on you even then, that she spent her days repairing what others could afford to damage. Your father taught you numbers, not out of any grand educational vision, but because someone had to count the grain sacks, and his eyes were failing faster than his pride would admit. By age 7, you were running errands for the local merchants, dodging horse carts and chamber pot contents with equal agility. You learned that a penny saved was a penny earned, but more importantly, that a penny taken was a penny that didn't need earning. Not that you stole, not exactly. You simply developed a talent for being in the right place when coins fell from purses, when merchants miscounted change, when distracted customers walked away from their purchases. The Winchester market was your first university. You studied the art of commerce with the dedication of a monk studying scripture. You watched how merchants inflated prices for outsiders, how they short-changed those who couldn't read numbers, how they created scarcity where none existed. Most importantly, you learned that honesty was a luxury only the wealthy could afford, and even they chose not to most of the time. Your mother died when you were 12, coughing up blood into rags that grew progressively redder, until there was nothing left to cough. Your father followed her within a year, his bent back finally giving out as he lifted one sack too many. The baker who owned your room wanted rent money you didn't have, so you found yourself sleeping in doorways and eating whatever you could beg, borrow, or creatively acquire. It was during this period of creative acquisition that you first encountered the tax collectors. They arrived in Winchester like a plague of well-dressed locusts, accompanied by armed guards and bearing documents that might as well have been written in ancient tongues, for all the common folk could understand them. They went door to door, demanding payments for wars most people couldn't locate on a map, for a king who seemed to exist mainly as an excuse to empty their purses. You watched from the shadows as families surrendered their last coins, as merchants closed their shops rather than pay assessments that would bankrupt them, as the collectors themselves lived better than the nobles they supposedly served. It was educational. More than that, it was inspirational. The head collector was a man named Aldrich the Meticulous, so called because he counted everything twice and trusted no one completely. He had soft hands, expensive clothes, and the kind of well-fed face that comes from eating other people's bread. His guards respected him, the merchants feared him, and the common folk cursed him behind closed doors. You decided you wanted to be him. Approaching Aldrich required strategy. You couldn't simply walk up to a royal tax collector and ask for employment when you looked like what you were, a homeless orphan with more ambition than sense. So you began small. You started hanging around his lodgings, learning his routines, discovering his weaknesses. The man had a fondness for sweet wine and younger women, both of which cost more than his official salary should have allowed. Your opportunity came when Aldrich's purse was stolen by actual thieves, crude men with no appreciation for subtlety. You followed them, waited until they were drunk on their success and strong ile, then retrieved the purse while they snored in an alley. Rather than keeping it, you returned it to Aldrich, claiming you'd chased off the thieves yourself. It was a lie that served everyone's interests. Aldrich got his money back, you got his attention, and the thieves never knew they'd been robbed by someone half their age. Impressed by your supposed heroics and obvious intelligence, Aldrich took you on as a clerk. Your job was simple in theory: record names, amounts owed, amounts collected. In practice, it was an education in creative accounting that would have made Lucifer himself take notes. The first lesson was that numbers were flexible things, subject to interpretation and modification based on circumstances. If a merchant claimed he could only afford to pay half his assessment, you recorded the full amount as collected but noted the difference as administrative fees. If a nobleman paid his taxes in goods rather than coin, those goods somehow developed mysterious tendencies to multiply between assessment and recording. The second lesson was that fear was more valuable than honesty. A terrified taxpayer would pay extra to avoid imaginary penalties. A confused taxpayer would pay twice rather than argue with documents they couldn't read. A desperate taxpayer would pay anything to avoid debtor's prison, real or threatened. The third lesson, and perhaps the most important, was that everyone was stealing something. Aldrich skimmed from the crown's revenues. The merchants reported their profits. The nobles claimed exemptions that didn't exist. Even the common folk hoarded grain and hid livestock to avoid assessments. In a world where everyone was cheating, the only crime was getting caught. You proved to be an exceptionally quick study. Within 6 months, you had mastered the art of the gentle extortion, the subtle threat, the creative interpretation of tax law. You learned to dress well enough to command respect, but not so well as to attract unwanted attention from your superiors. You discovered that a sympathetic ear could extract more information than a harsh voice. That people would confess their financial secrets to someone who seemed to understand their struggles. Your first independent assignment came when Aldrich sent you to collect back taxes from a village called Little Wickham, a collection of mud huts and broken dreams about a day's ride from Winchester. The village owed the Crown 37 shillings in unpaid assessments, a fortune by their standards, pocket change by yours. Aldrich expected you to collect what you could and report back with whatever story would satisfy the regional administrator. Little Wickham was poor in the way that only medieval villages could be poor, where poverty was passed down from generation to generation like family names or genetic defects. The villagers raised turnips and hope in roughly equal measure, and both crops had failed that year. Their reeve, a man named Edgar, who looked like he'd been carved from the same weathered wood as his walking stick, met you at the village boundary with the resigned expression of a man watching his own execution. The official assessment was 37 shillings. The village's total liquid assets, after you'd inventoried everything they owned including livestock and stored grain, came to perhaps 23 shillings if you were generous with your valuations. This presented what more honest men might have called a moral dilemma. You had several options. You could report back that the village was unable to pay and recommend reducing their assessment. You could seize what assets they had and leave them to starve, which would solve the immediate problem, but create larger issues when dead peasants failed to pay future taxes. You could threaten them with imprisonment until they somehow found money that didn't exist. Or you could be creative. You announced to the assembled villagers that their assessment had been reviewed and found to contain several errors. Through careful examination of the relevant statutes, you explained in your most official voice you had determined that they were entitled to certain exemptions based on crop failures, livestock diseases, and military service performed by village members. After applying these exemptions and calculating the appropriate reductions, their total obligation came to exactly 23 shillings. The villagers were so grateful they practically wept. Edgar shook your hand until you thought it might fall off. The village priest offered to say masses for your soul, an offer you politely declined. You collected the 23 shillings, provided official receipts for the full 37, and rode back to Winchester with a clear conscience and 14 shillings of pure profit nestled in your purse. Aldrich was impressed, not just by the fact that you'd collected the full assessment from a village everyone knew was destitute, but by the elegant simplicity of your solution. You'd satisfied the administrative requirements, kept the peasants from rebellion, and discovered a sustainable source of additional income. It was, he said, exactly the kind of creative thinking the tax collection service needed more of. Your success at Little Wickham opened doors to larger opportunities. Aldrich began sending you to handle more complex cases, merchants who claimed their goods had been stolen, nobles who insisted their estates were exempt from certain levies, monasteries that claimed poverty while living in buildings that cost more than most villages would see in a lifetime. Each assignment taught you new lessons in the art of profitable dishonesty. Merchants, you discover, could always find additional funds when faced with the prospect of having their businesses shut down pending investigation. Nobles would pay substantial sums to avoid having their exemption claims examined too closely by higher authorities. Monasteries, despite their vows of poverty, somehow maintained impressive collections of gold chalices and silver candlesticks that could be assessed for taxation purposes. The key was never to be too greedy. Take too much, and people complained to higher authorities. Take too little, and you missed opportunities that might not come again. The perfect amount was just enough more than the official assessment to make your efforts worthwhile, but not so much that anyone felt compelled to question your methods. By your 18th birthday, you had moved from clerk to junior collector, with your own horse, your own seal, and your own territory to manage. Your territory included 6 villages, 2 market towns, and a monastery that specialized in illuminated manuscripts and creative bookkeeping. You were earning more in a year than your father had seen in his lifetime, and you were just getting started. The monastery proved particularly educational. Brother Aldwin, the treasurer, was a man who had clearly chosen religious life after a successful career in secular larceny. He kept 3 sets of books, one for the king's tax assessors, one for the church hierarchy, and one that presumably recorded something resembling the truth. Your job was to assess their taxable income based on the first set, while pretending not to notice the existence of the other 2. Brother Aldwin understood that you understood the game. He also understood that you could make his life very difficult if you chose to examine his records too closely. So you reached an arrangement that benefited everyone except the royal treasury. The monastery's official income remained modest enough to justify minimal tax assessments, while your personal income benefited from their gratitude for your discretion. It was Brother Aldwin who introduced you to the concept of tax farming, a practice that would transform your career from profitable to genuinely lucrative. Rather than simply collecting taxes for the crown and skimming what you could bid for the right to collect taxes from specific regions. You would pay the crown a fixed amount for this privilege, then keep whatever you could collect above that sum. The beauty of tax farming was that it aligned everyone's incentives properly. The crown received guaranteed revenue without the administrative headaches of actual collection. You received unlimited earning potential limited only by your skill and creativity. The taxpayers received the same level of service they'd always received, which was to say, minimal service and maximum extraction. Your first tax farming contract covered the same territory You'd been managing as a junior collector, but now you were responsible for generating £400 per year for the Royal Treasury. Anything above that amount was yours to keep. It seemed like a manageable target until you actually calculated how much additional revenue you'd need to generate to make the arrangement profitable. The mathematics were daunting but not impossible. Your existing methods of creative assessment and selective exemptions could probably generate an additional £50 to £75 per year. To reach your targets, you'd need to develop new approaches, expanded services, and perhaps most importantly, a larger network of cooperative officials. Cooperation, you learned, was often a matter of proper incentivation. The local sheriff, who might have questioned your more creative interpretations of tax law, became much more accommodating when his own assessment was reduced due to his valuable service in maintaining order during collections. The magistrate, who might have entertained appeals from overtaxed merchants, found his court calendar much more manageable when his own properties enjoyed certain undefined exemptions. Village reeves presented a different challenge, as they typically owned little that could be exempted and earned less than could be effectively reduced. For them, you developed a system of small but regular payments for their cooperation in identifying wealthy villagers who might have been assessed in previous years. A reeve who helped you discover a prosperous farmer's hidden grain stores might find a few extra coins in his purse, and his own assessment mysteriously reduced. The most profitable discovery was that fear of taxation was often more valuable than taxation itself. A merchant who believed he was about to be assessed for back taxes on undeclared profits might pay substantial sums for an exemption from that assessment. The fact that no such assessment had been planned was irrelevant. What mattered was his belief that it might be coming and his relief when it didn't. You began scheduling regular reassessment reviews for your most prosperous taxpayers. These reviews typically concluded that their previous assessments had been too low and needed to be adjusted upward to reflect their true circumstances. However, you could often find legal justifications for maintaining their current assessments in exchange for modest administrative fees. These fees, being entirely voluntary and unrelated to their official tax obligations, didn't need to be reported to higher authorities. Within 3 years, you were generating nearly £700 annually from your territory, while remitting the required £400 to the Crown. Your personal income exceeded that of many minor nobles, and your reputation for efficient collection attracted the attention of regional administrators who began offering you additional territories. Success, however, brought new challenges. Higher authorities began asking questions about your methods. Not suspicious questions, necessarily, but the kind of inquiries that suggested someone was paying attention to your results and wondering how they might be replicated elsewhere. The regional administrator, a man named Sir Geoffrey, who had inherited his position along with his title and appeared to have inherited little else, summoned you to Winchester to discuss your techniques. Sir Geoffrey was the kind of man who measured success in pounds collected and cared little about the methods used to collect them, but he was curious about your efficiency ratings. You prepared for the meeting carefully, developing explanations that were truthful without being complete. You emphasized your attention to detail in identifying previously missed taxable assets. You described your systematic approach to ensuring that all eligible taxpayers were properly assessed. You mentioned your success in reducing administrative costs through improved organization and record keeping. All of this was accurate. You simply didn't mention that your attention to detail included noticing which taxpayers were most likely to pay extra to avoid scrutiny, that your systematic approach included systems for extracting voluntary contributions, or that your reduced administrative costs reflected the fact that you were keeping a substantial portion of what you collected. Sir Geoffrey was impressed enough to offer you a significantly larger territory that included 2 market towns, several prosperous villages, and a small city with actual walls and a charter. The tax farming contract for this territory required annual remittances of £1,200, but the potential revenue was correspondingly larger. The city of Westbridge presented new opportunities and new complications. Urban taxpayers were generally more sophisticated than rural ones. more likely to understand their legal rights and more capable of appealing assessments they considered unfair. They were also wealthier, better connected, and more dangerous to antagonize. Your first tour of Westbridge revealed a thriving community of merchants, craftsmen, and minor nobles who had grown comfortable in their prosperity and correspondingly resistant to taxation. The city's charter granted it certain privileges regarding tax collection, including the right to appeal assessments directly to the King's Court. This meant that your usual methods of creative interpretation would need to be more subtle and legally defensible. The mayor of Westbridge, a wool merchant named Robert Fairfax, greeted you with the cautious courtesy of a man who knew that tax collectors could make his life either profitable or miserable. He arranged for you to be housed in the city's best inn, provided you with a clerk familiar with local customs, and invited you to dine with the city's leading citizens. The dinner was educational. You learned that Westbridge's merchants had developed sophisticated methods of spreading their risks across multiple ventures, making it difficult to assess their true wealth. You discovered that the city's guilds maintained their own systems of mutual support that could help members weather financial difficulties, including excessive tax assessments. Most importantly, you realized that these people had enough collective influence to cause you serious problems if you pushed too hard. This called for a different approach. Rather than trying to extract maximum revenue from each individual taxpayer, you began looking for ways to make the entire system more profitable for everyone involved. If the merchants could be convinced that cooperation with your efforts would benefit them in the long run, they might be willing to accept higher assessments in exchange for other advantages. You started by identifying the city's most significant unofficial economic activities. Westbridge's location on a major river made it a natural smuggling hub, and you quickly determined that a substantial portion of the local economy depended on goods that never appeared on any official manifests. Rather than trying to eliminate this trade, you began exploring ways to tax it indirectly. The breakthrough came when you realized that many of the city's legitimate businesses depended on the prosperity generated by illegitimate trade. If you could tax the legitimate businesses at rates that reflected their true income, while ignoring the sources of that income, everyone could maintain their comfortable fiction that nothing improper was occurring. This required delicate negotiations with the city's leading merchants. You couldn't explicitly acknowledge the existence of smuggling operations, but you could discuss the need to ensure that tax assessments reflected the true prosperity of the community. You couldn't offer to ignore illegal activities, but you could focus your attention on legal compliance rather than investigating potential irregularities. Mayor Fairfax proved to be a skilled negotiator who understood the benefits of reaching an accommodation. The city's merchants were willing to accept assessments that were 20% higher than their previous rates in exchange for predictable, efficient collection processes that wouldn't require detailed examination of their business practices. The arrangement was formalized through a series of meetings that produced no written records but achieved clear understandings. The city would remit taxes based on assessments that everyone agreed were fair and reasonable. Collection would be handled through the existing municipal government, rather than through individual audits. Questions about specific business practices would be referred to the mayor's office for initial review, before involving royal tax collectors. Your first year in Westbridge generated over £2,000 in revenue, while requiring only £1,200 in remittances. The merchants were satisfied because they could conduct their business without constant interference from tax officials. The mayor was satisfied because he could maintain his authority over municipal affairs. You were satisfied because you were earning more money than you'd ever imagined possible. Success in Westbridge led to opportunities in other cities. Sir Geoffrey began offering you contracts for entire regions, with remittance requirements that reflected the scale of your operations but left substantial room for profit. Within 5 years of your first tax farming contract, you were managing territories that stretched across 3 shires and generated annual profits that exceeded the incomes of most earls. With wealth came the need to manage it carefully. You couldn't simply deposit thousands of pounds with local moneylenders without attracting unwanted attention from both criminals and government officials. You needed to invest your profits in ways that would generate additional income while maintaining the appearance of a successful, but not suspiciously wealthy tax collector. Land was the obvious choice, but purchasing estates outright would have raised questions about your sources of funds. Instead, you began acquiring properties through intermediaries, often buying heavily mortgaged lands from nobles who needed quick cash more than they needed ancestral holdings. You would arrange for the mortgages to be transferred to entities you controlled, then foreclose when the original owners inevitably defaulted. This approach had several advantages. The original owners were typically grateful for the temporary relief, even if they understood they were eventually going to lose their properties. The transactions appeared to be legitimate business dealings rather than accumulations of suspicious wealth. The properties themselves generated rental income that provided legal explanations for your increasing prosperity. You also began lending money to merchants and minor nobles at rates that were profitable, but not obviously usurious. These loans were often secured by properties or businesses that could be seized if borrowers defaulted. More importantly, borrowers who owed you substantial sums were unlikely to complain about your tax collection methods or cooperate with any investigations into your activities. Your lending business proved particularly useful in managing local officials whose cooperation you needed. A sheriff who owed you money for loans to cover gambling debts was unlikely to question your interpretation of tax law. A magistrate whose son's debts you had quietly settled would probably rule in your favor in any disputes with taxpayers. A reeve whose family's farm was mortgaged through one of your intermediaries would certainly help you identify villagers who might be hiding taxable assets. The web of financial relationships you developed created a system of mutual dependence that made your operations increasingly secure. The more people who benefited from your success, the more people who had incentives to protect your interests. The more officials who owed you favors, the fewer officials who were likely to investigate your methods. By your 30th birthday, you had transformed from a homeless orphan into one of the wealthiest men in the region. You owned properties in 6 counties, held mortgages on dozens of estates, and controlled tax farming contracts that generated annual revenues exceeding £10,000. Your personal income was larger than that of most bishops and several earls. More importantly, you had developed systems that could operate with minimal direct supervision. You had trained assistants who could handle routine collections while you focused on larger opportunities. You had established relationships with local officials that ensured smooth operations even when you were absent. You had created networks of informants who could identify new prospects for taxation or investment. The transformation brought social changes as well as financial ones. You could no longer afford to be seen as a common tax collector who happened to be successful. You needed to establish yourself as a legitimate member of the landed gentry, someone whose wealth was accepted as natural rather than questioned as suspicious. This required careful attention to appearances and associations. You began dressing like a minor noble, complete with expensive fabrics and subtle displays of wealth that suggested prosperity without ostentation. You started attending church regularly and making substantial donations that demonstrated both piety and affluence. You began socializing with merchants and lesser nobles who could provide social legitimacy for your elevated status. Marriage became necessary, both for social acceptance and for practical estate planning. You needed a wife whose family connections would enhance your reputation, while whose dowry would add to your holdings. After careful consideration, you chose Margaret Whitmore, the daughter of a baron who owned substantial lands but needed capital to maintain them. The negotiations were conducted like any other business arrangement, because that's essentially what they were. Baron Whitmore needed money to pay debts that threatened his estate. You needed social standing that only marriage into established nobility could provide. Margaret needed a husband who could maintain her in appropriate style. The marriage contracts were structured to benefit everyone involved. Margaret proved to be an excellent choice. She was intelligent enough to understand the nature of your business without asking uncomfortable questions. socially skilled enough to help establish your position among the gentry, and practical enough to manage household affairs efficiently. She also brought valuable connections to families who could provide additional business opportunities or political protection. Your wedding was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of your arrival among the landed classes. You invited merchants, nobles, and government officials from across the region. The celebration was expensive enough to demonstrate your prosperity without being so lavish as to suggest improper sources of wealth. The guest list included enough important people to establish your social credentials while avoiding anyone who might ask awkward questions about your background. Marriage also required you to establish a proper household suitable for a gentleman of your standing. You purchased a manor house near Winchester that had belonged to a family whose financial difficulties you had carefully helped to create. The house came with extensive lands, established tenants, and a reputation for genteel poverty that your investment quickly transformed into modest prosperity. Running a gentleman's household presented new challenges and opportunities. You needed to employ servants whose loyalty could be trusted and whose discretion could be guaranteed. You needed to maintain standards of living that reflected your status while avoiding displays of wealth that might attract unwanted attention. You needed to engage in the social activities expected of a landed gentleman while protecting the business interests that funded your lifestyle. The key was to present yourself as a successful businessman who had prospered through hard work and wise investments rather than through taxation. Your official biography emphasized your achievements in improving tax collection efficiency and investing the proceeds in legitimate enterprises. Your actual methods of wealth accumulation remained discreetly unmentioned. Your reputation as an efficient tax collector brought opportunities to expand beyond your original territories. Sir Geoffrey recommended you to higher authorities as someone who could be trusted to handle difficult assignments in regions where previous collectors had failed to meet their targets. These recommendations led to contracts for tax farming in areas that had been considered unprofitable or impossible to manage effectively. The most challenging assignment was a region that included several large monasteries, 2 major market towns, and a collection of villages that had been devastated by recent warfare. Previous tax collectors had reported that the area was essentially uncollectible, with total potential revenue falling far short of administrative costs. Your preliminary investigation revealed that the previous collectors had failed because they'd approached the region as a traditional taxation problem rather than as a business opportunity. They had focused on collecting existing assessments rather than developing new sources of revenue. They had treated the various communities as separate entities rather than as components of an integrated economic system. The monasteries, you discovered, were engaged in extensive trade with each other and with secular merchants throughout the region. Their claims of poverty were technically accurate in terms of cash reserves, but ignored the substantial value of their agricultural production, manuscript copying, and craft manufacturing. More importantly, they were providing financial services to local merchants and nobles that generated significant unreported income. The market towns were struggling because warfare had disrupted traditional trade routes, but they retained their strategic advantages and most of their infrastructure. The primary need was capital investment to restore their commercial viability. If that investment could be provided in exchange for favorable tax arrangements, both the towns and the tax collector could benefit. The villages were genuinely impoverished, but many of them possessed assets that could be developed profitably with proper management. Abandoned farms could be restored and leased to new tenants. Water rights could be consolidated and sold to urban communities. Common lands could be enclosed and developed for commercial agriculture. Your solution was to treat the entire region as a development project rather than a tax collection territory. You negotiated agreements with the monasteries that recognized their special status while ensuring they contributed appropriately to royal revenues. You provided capital to help the market towns rebuild their commercial infrastructure in exchange for guaranteed minimum tax payments. You consolidated abandoned properties and developed them as profitable enterprises that could support sustainable tax assessments. The project required 3 years to complete, but the results exceeded everyone's expectations. The region that had been considered uncollectible was generating annual revenues of over £3,000 within 5 years. The monasteries had become profitable enterprises that could meet their tax obligations without compromising their religious activities. The market towns had recovered their prosperity and were attracting new merchants and craftsmen. The villages were supporting larger populations at higher standards of living. Your success with the development project established your reputation as someone who could solve problems that had defeated other administrators. This led to appointments to oversee tax collection in regions throughout England, with contracts that provided substantial base compensation plus significant performance bonuses. Each new territory taught you additional lessons in the art of profitable administration. You learned to identify and exploit regional economic patterns that weren't reflected in traditional tax assessments. You developed techniques for encouraging economic development that would generate sustainable increases in taxable wealth. You created systems for managing multiple territories efficiently while maintaining personal oversight of critical operations. By your 40th birthday, you controlled tax farming contracts covering territories that included over 200 villages, 30 market towns, and a dozen cities. Your annual remittances to the royal treasury exceeded £50,000, while your personal profits were approaching £20,000 per year. You had become one of the wealthiest commoners in England and arguably the most successful tax collector in the kingdom's history. Success at this level brought new challenges, particularly the need to manage political relationships with increasingly powerful officials. Your contracts were approved by regional administrators who reported to royal councillors who had direct access to the king. Your methods were subject to scrutiny from treasury officials who were responsible for ensuring that royal revenues met the crown's growing financial needs. The political environment was complicated by ongoing conflicts that required substantial military expenditures. The king needed more money than traditional tax assessments could provide, which created pressure to find new sources of revenue or to increase existing assessments beyond what taxpayers could realistically bear. Your solution was to propose a fundamental restructuring of the tax collection system based on the development model you had perfected in individual regions. Rather than simply collecting fixed percentages of assessed wealth, the system would invest royal resources in economic development projects that would generate sustainable increases in taxable income. The proposal required careful presentation to emphasize benefits to the crown while minimizing apparent risks. You prepared detailed financial projections showing how development investments could generate long-term revenue increases that far exceeded their initial costs. You provided case studies from your own territories demonstrating the practical success of the approach. You identified specific projects that could be implemented immediately with predictable results. The king's treasury officials were initially skeptical, as government bureaucrats tend to be when presented with innovative approaches to traditional problems. However, your track record of consistently exceeding revenue targets gave your proposals credibility that similar suggestions from less successful administrators would have lacked. The breakthrough came when you offered to guarantee the results personally. You proposed to invest your own resources in development projects, with the understanding that you would recover those investments plus reasonable profits from the increased tax revenues they generated. This arrangement would provide the crown with improved revenues without requiring any initial investment of royal resources. The pilot program was approved for 3 regions that had been underperforming under traditional collection methods. You were given authority to restructure tax assessments, negotiate new arrangements with local communities, and invest in development projects as necessary to achieve specified revenue targets. The results confirmed your projections. Within 2 years, all 3 regions were generating revenues that exceeded their previous performance by over 40%. The improvements were sustainable because they were based on real economic development rather than increased extraction from existing wealth. Your success with the pilot program led to expansion of the development approach throughout your territories and eventually to its adoption as official policy for tax collection in economically distressed regions. You were appointed as a royal commissioner with authority to oversee implementation of the new system and to train other administrators in its methods. The appointment came with substantial official compensation, extensive administrative authority, and most importantly, legal protection for your activities. As a royal commissioner, your methods were presumed to be legitimate unless proven otherwise through formal legal proceedings. This protection extended to your existing operations and provided security for your accumulated wealth. Your transformation from orphaned street thief to royal commissioner was complete, but your story was far from over. The systems you had developed were generating ever increasing profits while requiring less direct supervision. Your investments in land and lending operations were producing steady returns that diversified your income beyond taxation. Your political connections were providing access to new opportunities in government contracting and commercial development. Most importantly, you had established a legacy that would outlast your own career. The development-based approach to taxation that you had pioneered was being adopted throughout the kingdom and beyond. Young administrators were studying your methods and applying your techniques in their own territories. The principles you had discovered were becoming standard practices that would influence government policy for generations. But perhaps the most significant aspect of your transformation was personal. You had begun your career as a survivor, someone who took whatever opportunities presented themselves without regard for long-term consequences. You had evolved into a strategist who created opportunities and managed them for maximum sustainable benefit. The hungry orphan who had stolen bread to survive had become a gentleman who owned the bakeries. The desperate youth who had slept in doorways had become a lord who owned the houses. The ambitious clerk who had skimmed pennies from tax collections had become a commissioner who redesigned the entire system. You had learned that corruption was not simply a matter of taking what didn't belong to you. True corruption was about restructuring systems so that taking what you wanted became not just acceptable but admirable. It was about transforming theft into taxation, extortion into administration, and greed into policy. Standing in your study on a winter evening, reviewing reports from territories that stretched across half of England, you reflected on the journey that had brought you from the muddy streets of Winchester to the pinnacles of royal administration. You had achieved wealth beyond your childhood imagination, power that extended across vast territories, and respect from nobles who would have stepped over your starving body without a second thought. The fire crackled in your hearth, warming air scented with expensive candles and fine wine. Outside, snow fell on lands you owned, houses you had mortgaged, and villages you administered. Your wife was upstairs, pregnant with your first child, who would inherit a world you had shaped through decades of careful planning and relentless execution. You had succeeded beyond every reasonable expectation, but success had taught you that corruption was not a destination, but a journey. There were always new territories to develop, new systems to optimize, new opportunities to exploit. The skills that had lifted you from poverty could carry you even higher if applied with continued intelligence and determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. There were rumors of military campaigns that would require substantial funding, creating opportunities for those who could provide it efficiently. There were reports of economic disruption in distant territories that might benefit from development investment. There were whispers of political changes that could reshape the entire administrative system. But tonight, you were content to sit in your comfortable chair, sipping wine that cost more than your father had earned in a month, contemplating the empire you had built from nothing more than ambition and the willingness to see opportunities where others saw only problems. You had become exactly what you had set out to become, a corrupt tax collector whose corruption had become indistinguishable from excellence, whose theft had been transformed into service, whose greed had evolved into policy. In a world where everyone was stealing something, you had simply stolen more intelligently and more systematically than anyone else. And you were very, very good at it. The years that followed your appointment as Royal Commissioner brought challenges you hadn't anticipated. Success at your level attracted attention from quarters you'd never considered, including foreign merchants who wanted to understand English tax policies. church officials concerned about the implications of your development programs, and most dangerously, other ambitious administrators who saw your methods as either opportunities to emulate or threats to eliminate. The foreign attention proved profitable. Merchants from Flanders and the German states were struggling with their own taxation systems and were willing to pay substantial consulting fees for advice on implementing development-based approaches in their territories. These consulting arrangements provided additional income while creating useful intelligence networks that informed your domestic strategies. The church presented more complex problems. Your development programs often involved reorganizing agricultural production in ways that affected traditional tithing arrangements. Monasteries that had grown prosperous under your administration were attracting scrutiny from bishops who wondered why some religious houses were thriving while others struggled. The Pope himself had received reports about English innovations in tax policy that might provide models for financing religious activities. Your solution was to embrace the Church's interest rather than resist it. You began incorporating religious officials into your administrative structure, providing them with roles that gave them influence over policy while ensuring their interests aligned with your objectives. Abbots became development consultants who advised on agricultural improvements. Bishops became partners in lending operations that funded commercial expansion. The Church's moral authority provided legitimacy for your methods, while its financial resources provided additional capital for investment. The most serious threat came from rival administrators who recognized that your success was making their own performance look inadequate by comparison. Several regional commissioners had attempted to implement your methods in their territories, but lacked the experience or judgment to avoid the pitfalls you had learned to navigate. Their failures created political pressure to restrict development, based taxation to proven administrators, which meant restricting it essentially to you. This pressure manifested in various forms of bureaucratic harassment designed to limit your authority or discredit your methods. Audit requests multiplied, requiring you to document activities that had previously operated on informal understandings. Legal challenges emerged, questioning your interpretation of statutes that had been routinely accepted for years. Political allies found themselves reassigned to distant territories where they couldn't provide protection for your operations. Your response demonstrated how thoroughly you had mastered the art of institutional manipulation. Rather than fighting the restrictions directly, you began training other administrators in modified versions of your methods, while retaining control over the most sophisticated techniques. You created a network of protégés who could implement development programs under your guidance, while taking responsibility for any political consequences. You also began documenting your methods more systematically, not to satisfy audit requirements, but to create intellectual property that could be licensed to other administrators. The training programs and consulting services you developed generated substantial income while spreading your influence throughout the tax collection system. Officials who had learned your methods became advocates for your approach and defenders of your reputation. The documentation process forced you to analyze your own evolution more carefully than you ever had before. Writing detailed explanations of techniques you had developed instinctively required you to understand not just what you did, but why it worked. The exercise revealed patterns in your decision, making that you hadn't consciously recognized and principles that could be applied to situations beyond taxation. You realized that your success had been based not just on dishonesty, but on a sophisticated understanding of incentive structures and human psychology. You had learned to design systems where everyone involved benefited from cooperation, while the costs were distributed so widely that no individual felt compelled to resist. Your methods worked because they made corruption feel like virtue and exploitation feel like development. This insight led to your most ambitious project, a comprehensive reform of the entire English tax system based on principles you had discovered through years of practical experimentation. The reform proposal was presented as a solution to the Crown's chronic revenue problems, but its real purpose was to institutionalize approaches that would guarantee your continued prosperity regardless of political changes. The reform package included provisions for systematic economic development in underperforming regions, standardized training for tax administrators, and performance-based compensation that would reward efficiency improvements. It also included subtle modifications to legal procedures that would make it virtually impossible to investigate certain types of administrative decisions and bureaucratic structures that would ensure development programs remained under the control of experienced practitioners. Gaining approval for comprehensive reform required political maneuvering at the highest levels of government. You needed support from Treasury officials who controlled policy implementation, regional administrators who would be affected by the changes, and ultimately from royal councillors who advised the king on major policy decisions. Your approach was to frame the reforms as responses to external pressures rather than internal initiatives. The kingdom was facing increased military expenses due to ongoing conflicts, growing competition from foreign merchants who were implementing more efficient commercial practices, and administrative challenges in newly acquired territories that didn't fit existing bureaucratic structures. The reforms you proposed would address all these problems while generating additional revenue for the crown. Military campaigns could be financed through development investments that would continue generating income long after the wars ended. Commercial competition could be met by creating more efficient administrative systems that reduced business costs for English merchants. New territories could be integrated through standardized development programs that had proven successful in existing regions. The king himself never became directly involved in the reform discussions, as such detailed policy matters were handled by his councillors and treasury officials. However, your reputation for consistent revenue generation ensured that your proposals received serious consideration from officials who were constantly pressed to find new sources of royal income. The approval process took nearly 2 years and required compromises that modified some of your original proposals. However, the final reform package retained the essential elements that would protect your interests while expanding your authority. You were appointed as the first Director of Revenue Development, a position that gave you oversight authority for tax collection throughout the kingdom and responsibility for implementing the standardized development programs. Your new position required you to relocate to London, where you could maintain closer contact with Treasury officials and coordinate activities across multiple regions. The move meant leaving the comfortable manor house, where you had established your reputation as a country gentleman, but it also provided opportunities to operate at a scale you had never previously imagined. London in the 14th century was a city of perhaps 40,000 people, making it by far the largest community in England and one of the most important commercial centres in Europe. The concentration of wealth, political power, and commercial activity created opportunities for someone with your skills and resources that simply didn't exist anywhere else. You established your household in a substantial house near the royal treasury, close enough to maintain daily contact with government officials, but located in a neighbourhood that reflected your status as a successful administrator rather than your wealth as a private investor. The house itself was impressive without being ostentatious, furnished in a style that suggested prosperity based on legitimate achievement. Managing your various business interests from London required developing new administrative systems. You could no longer personally oversee operations in distant territories, so you needed trusted representatives who could make decisions in your absence while remaining accountable for their results. You also needed secure communication methods that would allow you to coordinate activities across the kingdom without creating written records that might be discovered by unfriendly investigators. The solution was to create a network of former students and proteges who had learned your methods while serving as junior administrators in your territories. These men understood your techniques, shared your objectives, and could be trusted to implement your policies without detailed supervision. More importantly, they had their own incentives to ensure the success of development programs, since their own careers depended on demonstrating measurable results. Your role as Director of Revenue Development provided legal authority for the coordination activities that had previously operated in bureaucratic grey areas. You could now issue official directives to tax collectors throughout the kingdom, authorize development investments using royal resources, and modify assessment procedures to reflect local conditions. The authority was extensive enough to legitimize almost any administrative decision you chose to make. The position also provided access to information that enhanced your private business activities. You learned about planned military campaigns before they were announced publicly, allowing you to invest in supplies and logistics before prices increased. You received reports about economic conditions in regions throughout the kingdom, enabling you to identify investment opportunities before they became widely known. You participated in policy discussions that revealed government intentions regarding trade regulations, tax changes, and territorial expansion. This information was valuable not just for your own investments, but for the consulting services you provided to merchants and nobles who needed to anticipate government actions that might affect their business interests. A merchant who knew about planned tariff changes could adjust his inventory accordingly. A noble who understood new tax policies could restructure his holdings to minimize their impact. The advice was always presented as informed speculation based on your general knowledge of government operations, rather than as specific intelligence obtained through official channels. Your consulting practice became one of the most profitable aspects of your overall business portfolio. Wealthy clients were willing to pay substantial fees for advice that could save them much larger amounts in taxes or help them profit from policy changes. The relationships you developed through consulting also provided opportunities for joint investments and lending arrangements that generated additional income. The lending business had evolved from a simple profit center into a sophisticated tool for managing political and economic relationships. You now maintained loan portfolios that included debts from merchants in dozens of cities, nobles who owned estates throughout the kingdom, and government officials whose cooperation was essential for your administrative activities. The web of financial relationships gave you influence that extended far beyond your official authority. Perhaps most importantly, your lending operations provided a mechanism for converting tax collection profits into legitimate investment returns. Money that had been generated through creative interpretation of tax law could be loaned to borrowers who used it for clearly legal purposes, then repaid with interest that represented legitimate business income. The process gradually transformed questionable gains into unquestionable assets. By your 45th birthday, you had achieved a level of wealth and influence that placed you among the most powerful men in England, despite your common origins. Your official position gave you authority over tax collection throughout the kingdom. Your private investments provided income that exceeded your government salary. Your political connections included relationships with nobles, church officials, and government administrators who controlled most aspects of English economic policy. More importantly, you had created systems that could operate successfully regardless of political changes that might affect individual officials or policies. Your methods had been institutionalized through the tax reform program and were being implemented by administrators who had learned them under your supervision. Your investment portfolio was diversified across multiple sectors and regions, making it resistant to local economic disruptions. Your political influence was based on usefulness rather than personal loyalty, ensuring its survival through changes in government personnel. The success had exceeded every goal you had established when you began your career as a junior tax collector. You owned more property than most earls, controlled more capital than most merchants, and exercised more administrative authority than most royal councillors. Your wealth was sufficient to fund your lifestyle at any level you chose, while your investments continued generating returns that increased your capital faster than you could spend it. But success at this level brought responsibilities and risks that you had never anticipated. Your position made you a target for anyone who opposed government tax policies or resented the efficiency of English administration. Your wealth made you vulnerable to criminals who specialized in targeting prosperous victims. Your influence made you a potential threat to officials who controlled policies that might conflict with your interests. The risks required constant attention to security measures that affected every aspect of your daily life. You travelled with armed guards whenever you left London, used trusted intermediaries for sensitive business transactions, and maintained multiple residences so that your location couldn't be easily predicted. You also cultivated relationships with officials in foreign governments who could provide sanctuary if political conditions in England became dangerous. The security measures were expensive and inconvenient, but they were essential for protecting the empire you had built over decades of careful planning and execution. More importantly, they were evidence of how completely you had transformed from a powerless orphan into someone whose enemies needed to be taken seriously. Your marriage to Margaret had produced 3 children who would inherit not just your wealth, but your understanding of how power actually functioned in medieval society. Your eldest son was being educated by tutors who taught him languages, mathematics, and legal principles that would prepare him for administrative or commercial careers. Your daughters were being prepared for marriages that would strengthen your family's political connections, while providing them with comfortable lives. The children represented both your greatest achievement and your greatest vulnerability. They were proof that your success had created something permanent that would outlast your own life. But they were also potential targets for anyone who wanted to pressure you into making decisions that conflicted with your interests. Protecting your family required the same systematic planning that had characterized your business activities. You established separate households for your wife and children in locations that weren't publicly associated with your official residence. You created trust arrangements that would provide for their financial security even if your own assets were seized for political reasons. You developed contingency plans for relocating the family to safe territories if conditions in England became dangerous. The precautions might have seemed excessive to someone who hadn't experienced the transformation from powerless poverty to powerful wealth. But you understood that security was not a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who had accumulated assets that others might want to take. Your success had made you a target, and targets needed to be protected. Your 50th birthday was celebrated at a feast that demonstrated both your achievement and your understanding of the political requirements that accompanied it. The guest list included treasury officials who controlled your administrative authority, merchants whose businesses benefited from your policies, nobles whose estates had prospered under your development programs, and church officials who had supported your reform initiatives. The celebration was carefully orchestrated to reinforce the narrative of your career that you wanted remembered. You were presented as a dedicated public servant who had transformed tax collection from a burden that impoverished communities into a tool that promoted economic development. Your methods were described as innovations that had benefited the Crown, taxpayers, and the kingdom as a whole. The narrative was accurate, as far as it went. Your development programs had genuinely improved economic conditions in regions throughout England. Your administrative reforms had increased government revenues while reducing the bureaucratic burdens on taxpayers. Your training programs had created a generation of tax collectors who were more efficient and less corrupt than their predecessors. What the narrative didn't mention was that every improvement had been designed to benefit you as much as anyone else, that every innovation had included mechanisms for generating personal profit, and that your success had been based as much on sophisticated theft as on administrative excellence. But by your 50th birthday, the distinction between legitimate success and profitable corruption had become largely meaningless. Your methods had been adopted as official policy. Your techniques were being taught to government administrators throughout the kingdom, and your approach to taxation was being studied by foreign officials who wanted to implement similar programs in their territories. You had not simply become wealthy through corruption, you had redefined corruption to make it indistinguishable from good government. Your career had demonstrated that the most effective way to steal from the system was to improve it in ways that made the theft look like service. Standing in your London house on that birthday evening, surrounded by guests who owed their prosperity, at least partially to your policies, you reflected on the journey that had brought you from the streets of Winchester to the pinnacles of English administration. You had achieved everything you had dreamed of as a hungry orphan. and much more that you hadn't known enough to dream about. The transformation had required sacrifices that went beyond the obvious risks and expenses. You had learned to think like a bureaucrat rather than a person, to measure success in terms of efficiency rather than morality, and to value outcomes over intentions. The skills that had made you successful had also made you into someone your younger self might not have recognized or approved of. But the alternatives had been poverty, powerlessness, and early death. In a world where survival required taking advantage of opportunities regardless of their moral implications, you had simply been better at identifying and exploiting opportunities than most people. Your success was proof that intelligence, determination, and flexibility could overcome almost any obstacle, including the accident of birth that had placed you at the bottom of society's hierarchy. Your legacy would outlast your life by generations. The systems you had created would continue operating long after you were gone, generating prosperity for communities throughout England while providing opportunities for ambitious administrators to build their own careers on foundations you had established. Your children would inherit not just wealth, but understanding of how to preserve and expand it through intelligent application of power. You had become exactly what you had set out to become, the most successful tax collector in English history. A man whose corruption had been transformed into policy, whose greed had evolved into governance, and whose theft had become indistinguishable from service. In a world where everyone was taking something from someone else, you had simply taken more systematically and more intelligently than anyone else. And you were very, very good at it.